afternoon, everyone, and good night to those persons who are joining us from South Africa. Welcome to the Threads of Change Empowering Social Workers podcast. My name is Tracy Rogers. I'm a lecturer and a researcher at the Social Work Unit at the University of West Indies, Mona campus. We are so excited to have you join us today. As part of this journey that was started by Dr. Joanna Simpson and Dr. Sharon McKenzie, this mission of theirs, by extension, the social work unit, and definitely our department, is to inspire and to equip social workers to become champions of change, advancing their careers, enhancing their communities, and enriching their lives. So welcome to Threads of Change. As I said before, my name is Tracy Rogers. I am delighted that you were able to join us. And let's just get right in. Today, we're going to be having a dynamic conversation with a room of diverse wisdom. I am very, very excited to introduce the persons who would be speaking on this podcast today. I'm fortunate to know each one of them individually and have really been moved by their work and their commitment to social work education, research, and practice. So I will start today by introducing each of the panelists. I will read a brief bio so you have a sense of who's in the conversation as we start today, and then we will get going. So I want to start by introducing Dr. Cheryl-Ann Boodram. Dr. Boodram currently serves as lecturer and practicum coordinator at the UWI St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. She holds a BSc, an MSW, and a PhD from the University of the West Indies, and a postmaster's certificate in advanced clinical social work from New York University. Her professional experience includes working with youth in communities, forced migrants, and people who have experienced loss following disasters. Her research on these areas has also led to publications in several international academic journals and presentations at international conferences. Dr. Boodram is hallmarked by her commitment to grassroots intervention and intrigued by the potential of vulnerabilized people to uncover solutions to their life challenges. Dr. Boodram. Next, we have Dr. Sibonsile Zibane, who I call Boni. Welcome, Dr. Zibane. She is the senior lecturer and academic leader in the discipline of social work at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. She has 30 years of diverse social work and humanitarian experience. Her research, her teaching, her community engagement expertise spans Afrocentric social work, community-based work, and Indigenous community. She also heads Ma'al Ideals Institute, which is really a means of community engagement. It has a focus on African-centered, trauma-informed care, gender and sexuality. As the project specialist and the founding member of the MACAD Institute, Dr. Zibane is instrumental in advancing African-centered scholarship in psychosocial community services. We are very excited to have her join us today. Next, we have Dr. Darren E. Wright. Dr. Wright is the Associate Dean in the School of Social Work in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences in Fayetteville State University, which is a HBCU, Historical Black University. He previously served as Associate Professor, Director of Practice Education and Practicum Activities at Clark Atlanta University for 18 years. So he brings a diverse background in leadership across corporate, academic, nonprofit, and military sectors. Dr. Wright's contributions to social work education extends nationally and internationally. His recent research has been published in the International Journal of Values and Ethics, and he focuses on ethics violations in social work decision making. He's also a full trainee. Welcome, 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 Dr. Wright. And last and certainly not least, we have Dr. David Camacho. Dr. Camacho earned his PhD in social work in advanced clinical practice at Columbia University. His postdoctoral training has been in behavioral geriatrics with the Weill Cornell Medicine Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Care. So Dr. Camacho's research focuses on developing and testing strategies that enhance the prevention and management of prevalent and morbid conditions associated with aging, primarily among Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, and other minority older adults. So his work has been supported by numerous prominent funding agencies. So his research is informed by his extensive direct clinical practice as a bilingual and bicultural, he's a Mexican and American clinical social worker, as well as his personal experiences as a caregiver. Dr. Camacho has held multiple clinical and research appointments across a variety of community settings in LA and New York. So when I say there is wisdom in this room, there is wisdom in this room, and it's a diverse set of wisdom grounded in social work as an academic discipline, as a practice-based profession, but it's also grounded in cultural and social identities, which have been historically marginalized. So let's jump right in. I want to start by inviting each of our panelists to respond to a reflection. When I reflect on how I've come to know myself in my sociocultural space, I'm struck all the time by how much I have been required to learn and unlearn as I figure out how to be in both my physical and my emotional body as a citizen produced by or in a post-colonial space. So I want us to start with that. I often think about that as my reflection on decolonization, what it is I have to learn and unlearn. So I want to open the floor and invite Cheryl-Ann, David, Darren, Bonnie to just briefly share in a couple of sentences. As a social work practitioner, researcher, educator, you can choose one or wear all the hats. What are some of the things have you been learning and unlearning when it comes to understanding decolonizing practices? So I'm going to invite Cheryl-Ann, just in the order that I'm seeing people on my screen. I'm going to invite Cheryl-Ann, then David to share, then Darren and Bonnie. I'm not seeing you, but I know you're there. So we're going to go in that order. Cheryl-Ann.
So I want to talk about what drew me to this work, and how I understood decolonizing and my own identity. Um, and that came about, from let me declare that I am still learning, and every day I learn something new about the need for decolonizing and how to go about it. And as a researcher, I recognize that I perhaps may have engaged in epistemological violence against populations simply because I went into situations privileging what I wanted to know as a researcher and not necessarily recognizing that I was coming as an outsider into the lives of people. Um, and that I became very confronted with that, and conflict emerged because I had to create space for people to share their stories and their sources of resilience. And I thought, as I got more into research, I recognized that research has shied away from participatory methods. And that, of course, had me deconstruct or unpack for myself, where did that come from? And it really came from perhaps the academy and my own practice as a social worker, having perpetuated westernized models. And so for me, as I reflect, I noticed that my engagement with communities showed a lot of resilience, and I started to understand resilience in a different way, and how that resilience is rooted within our social identity and our overcoming oppression and having to come through all of the historical antecedents. And so for me, as I reflect, those are the early beginnings of me as a researcher, and then by extension, educator, into that sphere of decolonization of social work.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Cheryl-Ann. So we already start the ball rolling with some of the major things we'll be unpacking. David, what are you learning and unlearning?
I'm more feeling than anything. So a little bit of background. I literally just got back from a conference that I attended. It ended this morning. And it was a very medicalized conference. And what I'm feeling now is just a reminder and what it means to be, again, minoritized in these common spaces. A lot of academics, top-notch academics, top universities, Stanford, Cornell, Harvard, et cetera, but you're reminded that you are minority. You are the weird one or the odd one out. And especially in the way we look at research. It was a very biological, certainly there's a need for biological research, but it doesn't mean that all problems are biological. It doesn't mean that we need to ignore, should be ignoring psychosocial factors, especially in the real world. If we want to affect change, we need to consider people's lived experiences. There was also very limited discussion about diverse communities here in the US. It was not even a thing. And so it's a reminder that, I'm still feeling, literally because I just said it this morning, I'm still feeling a little frustrated. I'm still thinking, trying to make sense of this situation. How do I move forward? But ultimately, the same way I've reacted before is you take this experience, feelings and emotions are a way of knowing. It reminds me that this is clearly not done. It's not right. And I need to channel this energy to inform my research and do better. So that's where I'm at, kind of at this space right now, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so powerful. Thank you. Thank you, David. I'm already seeing connections between Cheryl-Ann sharing and just reminding us that we're also feeling entities that are thinking. Um, and that's an important commitment to those things. Darren, what you learning and unlearning?
Thank you so much, Tracy. I'd like to begin first with a quote from Dr. Lerone Bennett in his book called The Challenge of Blackness, where he says, an educator in a system of oppression is either revolutionary or an oppressor. And over the course of my lived experiences as a human being who identify as someone of African ancestry and also indigenous ancestry, I had to learn to embrace all of those things because I think our systems either put you're either or. And I had to learn to embrace myself and what that meant as someone Trinidadian, also family origins in St. Vincent, Grenada, among the Garifuna people in St. Vincent, and what that all meant for me, the intersectionality of being human. And not just being, I'm only this, I'm only that. You see? And I think that is some of the things that I learned about myself and had to unlearn to understand that as human beings, I think as David said, diversity comes from a much more holistic place. And understanding that the person that you meet before you is like an iceberg, You see the top, but you don't see all that makes that person. And I think a part of decolonizing ourselves and learning certain things is to understand that people come to the table in a much more holistic manner than just an either or.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Darren. So building on that, the intersectionality of being human, I want to invite Dr. Zibane to share with us, what have you been learning and unlearning?
Good evening, colleagues. As been introduced, so as someone who is from South Africa, I am a product of oppression. I am a product of apartheid. I am a product of resilience. And I'm also a product of resistance. I'm part of communities that are very wounded, and healing for them, it's not just a necessity, it's really what will define the future of South Africa. Even at the university as an academic, I work with students who are really, they aspire to succeed. But for me, what pains me is to see how that success is being defined and how, the tool that they're using to reach towards that success. So for me, decolonizing social work or decolonizing agenda is not just a theoretical or just an academic exercise, but it is an ethical imperative for a profession that seeks to uphold human dignity, a profession that seeks to heal, a profession that seeks to empower others. So for me, it is not a choice. It is what I aspire as well, to attain, given my background, given the community where I come from, and given the challenges that we face all the time. I mean, we've tried, using all the fancy Western a framework, but they don't work. It means for us, we need to find solutions that are rooted in our way of living, in our way of doing things.
Thank you so much. So what a way to start. And just drawing from all that we've heard, capitalism and settler colonialism has
Oh,
She's
So-
frozen.
hello.
Yes, Dr. Rogers, you were
Yes.
frozen for about 5 minutes, so we missed some key things that you were saying. So you may just have to reframe that if you can, so that we and the listening audience again can hear it.
Thank you so much. That's so appreciated. Thank you. I guess I was drawing from Dr. Zibane and thinking about how what we've all said has really intersected, just in terms of thinking about our lived experiences involve oppression, but also resistance. I feel that's something that travels throughout our initial sharing. And so extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, like those things have really shaped the world that we embody in the US, in South Africa, in the Caribbean. And social work is very much deeply rooted in the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism. So when Cheryl-Ann shared, when Dr. Boodram shared about learning and reassessing how she enters communities, like a lot of those knowledge systems that we are all socialized into, they really were built on these social hierarchies and inequalities. So the question becomes, how can we decolonize our ways of being, of knowing, I want to say of feeling, and of acting in social work? And as we move towards affirming approaches to healing across macro, meso, micro settings, how can we do that work? So I want to open the floor and continue just the conversation around how do colonial structures and ideologies continue to influence social work practice, social work policies, social work education today? And anyone can jump in.
Tracy, I would like to share, and I like to tell stories, because within stories and experiences, we tend to learn so much. And the experience that I want to share is being on a WhatsApp group that was created for new practitioners, and there were students from Trinidad and Tobago that would have recently graduated from a number of universities. So it's not specific to one university. And on that chat, there was a member practitioner that was looking for support for a mother who had lost her job and the challenges in meeting the needs of her 2 children. You know, she was recently divorced and she had to pay rent. And as I looked at that, I became very concerned because I saw the perpetuation of a westernized approach to assessment and also to intervention. So the responses were quick to follow. You know, social workers were talking about welfare grants and food cards, and there were suggestions as to what were the barrage of documents that people needed, you know, and they suggested therapy for the mother after the divorce. And I reflected on this because I did not see where there was a reference to community-based support and the use of traditional and empowering ways to support the mother. There was no embracing of unique and traditional practices. It was just a one-size-fit-all model. The responses were westernized and Eurocentric, and mainly individualized. There was no talk about SWU and developing a cooperative or GAIAP or LENHAN. And so there were no traditional practices that emerged as perhaps an intervention. And so here was a practitioner within an NGO setting looking for support with a client. And you know, as social workers, the biopsychosocial assessment is solely associated with social work. But I didn't see a discussion about social identity of the client or even how the client interprets her own social identity. The second thing that came out for me was the focus was on the immediate past, but not how historical systems and the broader economic and social structures shape that woman's experiences. And the last thing I looked at in that was that there was an emphasis on individualized, pathologizing, and person-centered interventions rather than traditional practices of healing and support. And I thought that story was important and I wanted to share it because a couple of weeks ago I visited another university, and I recognized amongst the talk a similar situation happening. And so for me, decolonizing is really about providing frameworks that would be able to challenge colonial systems, systemic oppression, and continue to impact people's lives in a different way. And it is true to the mission of social work because the mission of social work and that social justice piece fits in so nicely with decolonized practices.
Yeah, if I can add, to what Cheryl just mentioned there, I like how she framed that through that story. A huge part of this conversation as well, we have to begin first of all by defining we define coloniality, but what is decoloniality? What does that look like? You know, I think oftentimes we have a very academic discussion with it. I know when we look at the work of what Belango and Walsh, you know, they begin to help us to understand how do we understand the impact that colonialism has had on us. And even sometimes in spaces where we are seeing Black and brown faces in positions of power, where there are no supposedly Europeans there, we still see the behaviors, practices, and attitudes, right, that we have embraced. While we know we need to change them, we have not developed the mindset, we haven't developed the moral courage to look at and examine those practices and say, you know, what we're doing here, probably doing that as our ancestors did that in response to a situation, right? So that doesn't mean because we're continuing to do that, that is really how we need to be, you know? Can we reimagine certain things? Can we be more intentional about certain things? We need to examine our policies, our practices, our behaviors, our attitudes, even as we talk about in academia. we in academia, we see ourselves as experts. We alone have the knowledge, right? We set certain policies and procedures in place that sometimes even are restrictive to students. I want to give you an example. I recently came home to take care of something, and I paid for with paper thing, and I said, you know what? I want another copy of this. And the person tell me, well, I had to go back all the way to the back of the line and start over the whole process. And I said, but I'm standing right here. Why can't I just pay for it and get it? That is the mindset, you see? So it is a mindset that is coming that these things were put in place back then to control and regulate people, and not necessarily to be the servants of the people. So we all have to examine ourselves in academia and begin to have the moral courage to dismantle systems, policies, procedures, and practices if we are going to talk about decoloniality and moving ourselves away from systems and processes and attitudes that Cheryl talked about.
If I may jump in as well, colleagues, I think for me, what is really important is acknowledging that the imposition of Western paradigms often alienates and marginalize those whose lives, are supposed, in fact, they seek to address. And the unfortunate part is, in many instances, when we are dependent on these Western paradigms, they often don't work. I think for me, the wake-up call was the crisis of COVID-19 and the crisis of the climate change, particularly in South Africa, where the Western paradigms were proven to be irrelevant, in addressing the lives of our communities. I mean, you talk about issues of burial, remember how many people were losing their lives, grief and bereavement. We as practitioners, I think Professor Wright spoke about, we always think we are experts, but we didn't have even the knowledge, we didn't even have the words, to explain, we didn't even have those theories to explain what is COVID-19, how is it impacting on the lives of the people. But I'll just talk about our experience as social workers who adopted African-centered. It was only through the adoption of African-centered approaches we were able to even speak and define, death and dying at that particular time. All the approaches, all the theories that we have learned, all the methods, the method that says you need to be aloof, you need to be neutral, you need to be distant, they were not really relevant, and they're still not relevant when we talk about issues of climate change, climate crisis, and issues of COVID-19. So it is important for us, one, to accept that we are not experts. We, in terms of knowledge, we have to co-create with our communities. Our communities, they possess knowledge that can really, we can learn from, and we've been learning from the communities, because honestly, what we've been learning in school, what has been imposed to our education, to our social work education, in certain contexts, it is not relevant. And even how do we define a person who needs our assistance, or a service user? It's also context specific, and we really need to start respecting, the knowledge that exists within a specific context. I think for me, that is what we should be doing. We need to sit back and look and start digging as to how the communities are able to sustain themselves. How can we then add or strengthen those ways, those resilience tools that they are using to sustain themselves? That's when we can really break away from the chains of colonial knowledge. Yeah, I think that's what I can share for now.
I'll jump in really quick. There's so much, just so much going on, so many thoughts, right? And so, one of the things that I'm trying to make sense of everything that has been said, but one of the things is that it's very important for us as clinicians, as researchers, as social workers, to really think about why we do what we do, right? So one of the things that I really appreciated when I was a PhD student is really thinking about how our position in the world, how our power, how our, privilege, how our life experiences contribute to the way we see the world, right? And this goes along with theories or practices, social work practices, research in this case. So there's been a lot of, reflection or reflexivity, and research is an ongoing process. So just my thought from this initial conversation was, well, who are we without colonialism at this point? Which to me is like, well, what does that actually mean? So I hear conversations about South Africa. For me, being of Latin American descent, Mexican, sure, I come from indigenous communities. I am a product of what was called the mestizaje, the mixture of European and indigenous communities in Latin America. But if you ask me, well, I want to go back to those indigenous, I don't know what that is exactly. And part of that has to do with there really is no space to sit and think. It's a privilege in itself to have a space to actually think about what that means, right? So we as academics are very privileged in having a space to think about what decolonialism actually means. And I say this because I think about my work, for example, in New York. I was up in the Bronx. If anybody knows, it's an impoverished community for the most part, immigrants, a lot of Latino individuals. They don't think about these things because they have other priorities that they need to think about, i.e. survive. So, this is very privileged, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, it's not easy. And one of the ways that I try to incorporate this is in every class that I teach, I push students to really think about why are they doing what they're doing? Like where are they in the world, and how do their perspectives, how do they think they know about the world, right? What do they think, is it a westernized perspective? Does this really apply to the world or the clients that they work with? So there is no easy answer, but it's a privilege to be able to think, but at the same time, who are we without this history? And what are we really aiming for with this thinking and reflexivity and, the way we want to change practice? Are we trying to just throw everything out and start from scratch? Or are we trying to use what we think we know so that we could better support our communities? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for that. One of the things that really stands out for me, to begin with, social work is a very diverse discipline. And because we travel, we transfer, we go across many domains. And we're also privileged. And that part about us, the fact that we can sit down and contemplate this in of itself is a privilege. And we work with people who are disenfranchised and historically marginalized. And amongst that population is also heterogeneous, and they have different ways of being and knowing. As a discipline, we are heterogeneous as well. But this idea of the lens that we adopt as a social worker, regardless of the domain in which we function, I think one of the things that's supposed to really define it is social justice. So if I'm doing research, it's social justice. If I am doing casework, it's social justice. And I think the other thing that stood out for me from our conversations is a need for us to confront ourselves in terms of how we embody this work, and a lot of times in terms of how we relate to other people in the field as well. So I guess I want to see how we can build on that. And as we think about what are some of the key principles or methodologies, and we've already named some of them as we started to talk, that needs to be part of a decolonized agenda, bearing in mind that that may look different to different professionals and specialization groups, and definitely to different populations. Like we're Black and brown, but we come with an intersection that really informs us showing up in the world differently. So what are some of the principles and methodologies that you think we have to privilege when we do this work, when we do decolonial work? Darren?
No, I love your question. I also appreciate David's comments. And the goal here is not to throw the babe out with the bathwater, as they would say. I think it is important for us to acknowledge the impact that coloniality has had on us. Look, I'm speaking English to you. I'm sure that as I trace my lineage, my ancestors, which came out primarily out of what is now called Nigeria and Togo and Ghana, didn't speak English, right? They can talk it, they were multilingual. So we deal with that given reality. However, we have to examine and reimagine what do we see as a just society, right? As people who have suffered under the yoke, the descendants of this system, but we enjoy benefits from it. For me, I embrace two principles from the Afrocentric perspective as defined at Clark Atlanta University. One, humanistic values. If I'm examining policies, procedures, are they humanistic? In that, do these are values that place priority on eliminating human oppression, regardless of race, color, creed, nationality, your intersectionality? Do they enhance that person's human potential, right? By valuing humanistic principles of equity, fairness, social and economic justice practice and concerns. So for me, that is important as I think about decolonizing something. I want to know if I am looking at a policy, I'm examining policies, practices, are they humanistic? Do they advance people? Do they recognize and see people and center them in the discourse, right? I am looking at that. The other thing I'm looking at is it strength-based? Is it looking at how people, the strengths of people identifying their strengths and building on it, or is it coming from a pathological point of view? The other part that's important for me is in terms of a universal and targeted perspective of, I think this is what Dr. Boodram was talking about. How is this intervention, because is it universalistic? I understand with the policy, how does it apply to everyone, but how may it apply to a specific group? We may have to have a much more targeted intervention or approach. To me, that is equally important as I think about decoloniality. And lastly, the validation of circular and linear logic. To the extent at which I understand that there's more than one way of knowing, being, doing, and showing up in the world. And am I open to respect all of that? Or am I just going to think that's the only way and all other ways do not matter? So for me, as I think from an Afrocentric perspective, I understand and value humanity, black, white, pink, polka dot, or whatever. But I don't want you to devalue me. I don't want you to devalue my way of doing things and saying that your way is the only way. And I want us to begin as social workers, that we begin to value people, we begin to see them as experts, that we are partnering with them, that we don't show up, collect data, print a publication, put it on our CV, become tenured and all these things, and then it has no value to the community. None. Do we include the community on the board? Do they get opportunities to give credence and their input? Or we just have them there because we want to say we've been inclusive? And the same is true for students. You see, because we have to model the behavior that we want them to go into the community and do. I get very passionate around that.
And we don't apologize for passion at all, especially
Passion is
coming
good.
from our discipline. Not at
Yeah.
all.
I'm sorry.
And we are moved by your passion. We are moved, and I can really relate, to that. Honestly, I'm also not looking for a very distant past. And my ancestors, maybe that I don't know, but I always acknowledge the fact that there is history behind me. I am because I belong. There are people who fought wars for me to exist. So I cannot get rid of that. So that is really important to me. But in terms of what I try to do. For me, I think it's always important that the decolonizing methodologies and principles that I adopt, they also reflect my commitment to restoring balance, to reclaiming epistemic agency. There are many ways of knowing, and for me, I think that's what Prof. Wright was saying, the respecting that people also have their rights to do things their own way instead of me prescribing. I know as a young therapist, when I'm maybe counseling a couple, I've given them even homework that really does not exist in my context, in our communities. And I've given them because I was informed by Western ways of doing things. And if I'm really interested in how they do things, I need to be invested in how they do things and strengthen how they do things. So for me, the principles that I always adopt, we adopt the principles of Ma'at: order, justice, reciprocity in whatever that we do. They should be, even if it's research, they should be beneficial to the communities. It can't be about me mining knowledge from the communities without them benefiting from anything. Whenever I do any intervention, even with the student, I must restore order. I should not uproot from how they live their lives. South Africans are very spiritual beings. Even sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's culture. They're very spiritual. So in my intervention, if God is what they believe in, if ancestors is what they believe in, I must assist them in making sure that there is order in that type, in that kind of belief system for them. And for me, language is very important, particularly for us in South Africa. It's also related to our history. During apartheid, Afrikaans and English was imposed to us. But then most of our communities, we have 11 official indigenous languages. All our communities, when they are at home, they speak in their indigenous languages. For me to show respect, when I engage with them, I try. I know language, I've lost so much in terms of the language, but I try my best to communicate them using their own language. Language not only in terms of the words, language even in terms of how I dress up when I'm going to the communities, how I position myself as a woman, or as not as a woman, or as a mother, or as a daughter, or as a practitioner. So for me, those are the things that I invest my energy in, because I'm not uproot. I'm not saying to them, go back to 18th century. No, I'm just trying to be practical with how they are living their lives now. But adopting the principles, I think for me, it is very important when we adopt the principles that are aligned with Ubuntu. We respect the fact that we are interconnected beings, the wholeness of a person. Yeah.
May I jump in really quick?
You can mute it.
Yes, I was just gonna say, sorry, I forgot I was muted. I was just gonna say, even with the diversity of communities that we come from, one of the themes that's coming up is how do we make sure that what we do is of the people, for the people, is accessible by the people. And that could be language in terms of English, but it is also language in terms of a dialect, a patois, a way of being. We show up as who we are. So when we talk about not replicating Western systems, it starts with just how we begin to frame the work. I wanna kind of open up for David and Cheryl-Ann as researchers, and I've seen your approach to research that I feel as though you walk into research spaces as who you are. And you encourage your participants, your co-constructors of knowledge, to come as who they are. So I guess I'm going to kind of also put out there if you wanted to take this invitation, or maybe you had something else you want to say, but I want to open the invitation around how do we take permission to show up as who we are, and what does that mean, and how do we allow people to show up as who they are in research?
I perhaps want to jump into the conversation here because in my own knowing and learning and unlearning, I've recognized that even the word help or research or education is socially constructed. And so I have had to reframe that along the principles of respect for knowledge and epistemologies that value local people. And so one of the things that guide me is this moving away from that word help, which has a different social connotations. And my guide is this quote by Lilla Watson that says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I think that quote really helps me to summarize the critical principle in research of respect for knowledge and epistemologies, and understanding that research is very privileged and it is very westernized. And the academy expects you to write in a way that does not appreciate or value ethno-linguistics or ethno-language. And we have therefore moved away from the traditional ways of knowing, those traditional epistemologies, such as oral histories, social practices, spiritual practices, communal wisdom. And so, in terms of research being very colonized, and we have to recognize that we can become perpetuators, or we can perpetuate unfair systems and epistemological violence, which is taking from people their stories and interpreting it with our vision. And moving away from that requires us to understand that principle of participatory work and participatory action, which means that we co-create knowledge. We do not privilege what we want to know, but we allow that space and hold space for people who want to tell us what's important to them. And we also have to understand our duty of care within research so that we don't sensationalize people's experiences for publication, but really we value their coping and social strategies. And this requires us then to have research done in a way that connects local experiences with the social, economic, and political and historical systems which impact on people's social identity.
There's, again, a lot, right? So I'm trying to make sense of all this again. One of the things that, for me as a researcher, as a clinician, and getting involved with minoritized and marginalized communities, and as a person who is minoritized, a brown person in academia, especially in the United States, first off, what was it? Dr. Wright, Dr. Zibane, you mentioned a very basic principle that I think I'm very much in line with, is this idea that we need to respect human dignity. Can we start there, right? Dr. Wright, you're in the United States, I believe, as well. So right now, we've lost that as a society. It's been very much with our recent elections, have a certain status in the United States, that immigrants are being dehumanized, and that's okay according to our votes. That my people are going to continue to experience fear and may not want to participate in research because, well, they're surely fearful for what might happen. At this conference, I jokingly said that, maybe I'll see you next year, but I might be deported before then, right? Even though I am a US citizen. It's a reality of our history, right? Our context, as Dr. Boodram just mentioned, context really matters. It's not just culture, but culture and context, the historical, the political context. I don't really see this so much in the research that, I tend to consume. The other thing is the many ways of knowing. It sounds very qualitative, and I love it, right? Dr. Rogers, we met at ICQI at the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry. Most research, though, is quantitative, assuming that there is one correct answer. The epistemology, the assumptions are very different. When we think about science, it's about numbers. The thing is that our marginalized communities are rarely represented in these large samples that are representative of whatever you want to be representative of. So we need to go out to communities and actually embrace conversations, a different way of knowing. One of the major problems in academia is that we value quantitative over qualitative. It's not, quantitative is up here, qualitative is down here, or it's an afterthought. Qualitative, I would argue, is a lot harder to do, especially narrative, especially embracing difficult subject. It's very difficult to do, but it's sorely undervalued. But with that said, I do both quantitative and qualitative, I need to embrace myself. I'm already a rebel by being in these spaces. So what's it if I become a rebel in the way I do my work? And just last week, I was on a panel talking about how do we recruit older Latinos, older adults who are of Latin origin, who are mostly immigrants. Well, part of that means undoing the damage that has been caused by our social systems. There's fear, they don't want to participate. It's very easy to blame individuals and say, hey, they don't want to participate in research. Versus let's acknowledge the history and why they're not participating in research. And we as researchers, as clinicians, need to do better to engage those communities. So we need to spend more time and go actually out there. I was writing a proposal over this past week as well, and I was trying to explain why it took me 45 minutes to an hour to screen older Latinos for my study. Well, I'm trying to be inclusive of people with potential cognitive impairment. That takes a lot of time. Trauma-informed principles includes, let's help them understand why we're doing the research, what that actually means for them. Let's make sure we create a space where they can feel safe. Let's put it in their language. Let's not speak academic or health language. It takes a lot. It's time-consuming. So we need to really think about how research and clinical systems are not designed for minoritized groups. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to happen. But it comes back to this very basic thing. How do we enhance human dignity? Can we start there? Comes back to that.
And can we start there across the domains? Darren, after Wright.
No, David, I thank you for your points. Those are eloquent, and I think it added to what Dr. Boodram emphasized. One of the things as well, again, there needs to be more intentionality, and I know we're doing that. Intentional and sustainable, that is important. I think as we think about reimagining how we do things from a pedagogical standpoint, even schools of social work, particularly because social work is seen in a gender hierarchical society, it's seen as women's work, right? So you don't see a lot of men in social work, right? And oftentimes in schools of social work, we are teaching our students how to practice, but there's a big void even in leadership. And what does leadership look like, right? We have a very, we still have views about leadership that do not see women as leaders. And we saw that even playing up in the case in the United States with the recent elections. And I think this is an area as well in social work education where we have an opportunity to begin to produce leaders by defining leadership as individuals who can identify the strengths in others, help others to understand the goal and objectives they're leading towards, and empowering those individuals to accomplish an agreed upon set of goals and ideas. And how do we begin to help students to understand the notion of servant leadership? For me, in communities that are coming out of oppression, we have embraced a lot of the leadership styles that are task-oriented, transactional, do this, do that, but it's not transformative, and it definitely is not servant-oriented, right? So in the terms of the great leader, for me, is the one who is willing to serve. So I think that is an opportunity as well for us to create opportunities around leadership, that we help students to understand transformative leadership, what it means to be a servant leader, what it means to be a leader who can impact the community. And I think these are ways that we also begin to humanize institutions and systems, as our dear sister from South Africa was pointing out. It has to be a sense of balance. We have to understand all the different ways, because when people show up for services, how we make them feel at the door impacts how they leave, right? So we go into a Fortune 500 company, and then I'll turn it over to someone else. You walk in, it's very nice, the service is good, you know, the painting on the walls. And sometimes you go into some of our social institutions, the building is run down, there's no service, people not taking care of things. These are all dimensions that impact how people perceive themselves, how people perceive their value, how we perceive the value of others in our community. All these are also spiritually aligned, because, you know, you walk into a place and you don't feel right, you're like, I don't like the vibes here. All these have to do with what I think is important for us to teach our students, for us to impart on society, that as a society coming out of a system, a condition, we need to be servants of each other, that we need to serve each other. And that is one way to lift up ourselves and make sure that we are in passing off humanistic values.
So we're approaching the close of this conversation, and I do want to ask anyone who's in the room who has a question to feel free to write it in the chat, and you know, perhaps we can get to some of those. As we all share, I am just struck by how much social work is an embodied practice. And one of the things about this conversation that's so beautiful is that we're talking about practice, we're talking about research, but we're talking about education, we're talking about the students that we serve, we're talking about, you know, very early, David put feelings on the table. So we're also talking about the fact that we are also feeling people, you know, with emotions as we're working through here. As we're walking and working through the space. So one of the things I guess I want us to talk for a few minutes about decolonizing the social work curriculum. And I also want to say about decolonizing ourselves as educators, because it is an embodied practice. This notion of servant leadership that you have invoked, Darren, is also very powerful for me. So I want to open up the floor and ask us to think about in what ways should social work education evolve to foster decolonized perspectives for future practitioners? Like, where do you see us going? What do you think we need to prioritize? How have you been dipping into those spaces in your work as an educator? I feel some of this we've touched on already. So I want to open up the floor with that.
One of the first thoughts as social workers, and I'm curious to hear from others as to what the experience is. In my experience, in terms of master level social workers, for example, there's either limited interest or limited understanding of research, right? So one of the values here, core competencies in the United States is that students should practice evidence-based or research-informed, practice should be guided by research and research should be guided by practice, right? I don't think as social workers, we do a good enough job to get master level students aware and understand research and be critical consumers of research. So we need, so I constantly find myself in courses saying, hey, let's start off with, the role of research in this, theory and practice. These are all interconnected. So think about research and who's represented in that research, for what purpose, based on what theory. So this needs to be normalized in the way we examined MSW curriculum. It should be incorporated as a standard practice. We should be very critical and be good consumers. And oftentimes the answer is what's predominantly white, westernized theories and practice and samples, etc. Do you really think that this research supports the work that you're trying to do with your communities? If so, how? If not, how? So again, being very critical of how we consume supposed knowledge.
From my perspective, we have to remember that students also occupy that space within communities. And in integrating in decolonizing social work education, we need to decolonize content. So the material, first of all, the material that we share, we have to ensure that it is focused on social justice. But for us in the Caribbean, ensure that there is a range of material that speaks to the Caribbean experience and Caribbean experiences. And I want to throw out something here that is probably going to be very controversial for educators, but we also need to decolonize assessment, because our assessment reinforces a hierarchy, a power imbalance. And so you have to pass a certain level, you have to write in a particular language. But social workers practice is a profession that is practice-based. There is a book called Ungrading that I love, because there is a need for us to decolonize the way that we assess our students' performance, not only in the formal courses where there may be an exam, but even in our practicum spaces. We also need to decolonize our supervisory methods within field education, and of course, as persons graduate, decolonize the way that they get their supervision. And I think the movement has to be around more liberatory practices, where there is that transformation of student, but also the space for the student to be. So we have to hold spaces for that student to be and to emerge and to develop. And so if we are to decolonize social work education, we also need to take a look at ourselves and how we as educators perpetuate unfair practices, or perhaps support taken for granted knowledge that may be based in unfair practices or oppressive practices around content, around assessment, even around supervision.
I agree. I think whatever I say here is just in agreement with everyone else. It is an issue. As I began my conversation, we need to look at our practices, our policies, our procedures, our behaviors, and our mindset in terms of social work education. And I think Dr. Boodram laid out a lot of things. For example, licensure, right? We want people to be to have a certain level of competency, and we want the public to know that they're working with someone who's competent. But more and more the discussion in the United States, as we know, is that licensure is rigged on many levels. We are seeing that Black and brown people are not passing the licensure exam. There's issues and discussions around some of the content, and it's tied to capitalism. So whatever we do in this discourse we're talking, we cannot divorce capitalism and the impact that has on anything we are talking about here in relation to decolonizing, right? Because at the end of the day, that drives so much of our practices, our behaviors and our attitudes and thoughts around things, right? And we haven't had a discussion around that. And now what we see, what's going on with the new president of the United States, who is by extension the president of the world. This is the reality when you're a superpower. Those who hold power usually determine who they define reality, unfortunately. So we see the notions of the impact capitalism has even on our systems, as David is saying, because if you don't produce certain things from a quantitative standpoint, it might impact your funding. It impacts your rankings, your ratings. So all these things we are balancing while trying. We know the need to decolonize, but we have these things that we need to do. This is not easy work. This is work that we have to be continuous. But look, we are descendants of individuals who know what it means to give a good fight. Was the journalists would say, good trouble, right? So we have to continue getting in good trouble to make the changes needed. And this is not going to be easy work, but we have to keep chomping at this big elephant bit by bit.
No, thank you, colleagues. I think I also agree with all what has been said. I don't even want to repeat the wisdom that is coming from the colleagues. And for me, I just want to remind ourselves, myself included, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So I think for me, by doing this kind of work, it's how we are also showing how much we care. As all the colleagues have said, this is a liberation agenda. So it is not an easy thing. It is very expensive. It is expensive to you as an academic. It is expensive to you as a practitioner. Personally, I've suffered because of this agenda in terms of my upward mobility within the university system. You have to sacrifice yourself if you are really committed to this agenda. I'm not saying we should not really balance. Balance is important, but it needs a sacrifice. It needs us to prioritize. When we're saying we want to decolonize our curriculum, it should be a commitment. This is a struggle, and we need to understand it as a struggle. It won't be given to us. We won't be given those funding grants that support the agenda. It's like we are overthrowing the government. So it is important for us to understand we are in the struggle and the struggle continue. We should not really despair.
Thank you so much. I want to invite, and maybe what we can do is spotlight everyone, because I want to invite a closing reflection from everyone as we approach the last 15 minutes of our time together. So we have been talking about how hard this work is, about how important resistance is, the fact that this is an embodied practice across the domains of research, policy, casework practice, and of course, community work, regardless of how we operate as social workers. If we're not operating in community, then we're missing we're missing a fundamental core. So I want to invite each of us to kind of reflect on the journey that you have been part of towards building a decolonized approach to doing work. And I will invite each person to briefly, coming out of this conversation, like, what are the things that something that someone else said that stood out for you, that you're taking as part of your learning and your commitment to do this work. So I'm going to let you reflect on that for 2 minutes while I just really briefly go to the chat. There's some powerful, really powerful things in the chat, and we probably won't be able to go through all of it, but this is not easy work, and we try what we can. So I invite you to all take some time to look at what is there. But I'll just briefly share some of what has been shared. A strong and safe space for decolonizing social work practice to create, to collaborate, and to thrive. A space to build, to skill build for our practitioners. For our academic spaces, opportunities for decolonization scholars to create, write, publish together, but have active and meaningful partnerships with community scholars and leaders. And I think that really goes with what we've been saying, how do we embody this practice? Hello? I don't know what happened. My mic shut out for a little bit, but we rolling with the punches. Dr. Wilson Scott is in the chat, and Dr. Wilson Scott is actually part of a publication that recently came out around affirming methodologies in the Caribbean and how do we locate ourselves in research. And she comes out from a school of thinkers and researchers and encourage us to think about Liming and Old Talk as methodology, right? Because we operate and move through the world in a specific way, and we can do research in that way. And she's encouraging us that the process of decolonization requires us to challenge sources of knowledge, even the sources of our values. It also entails a relinquishing of power that often is bestowed upon us as qualified academics, especially when we move into spaces of working with community. So please, I encourage you to read the chat. I am mindful of time. Karen Cumberbatch has also put something in there, and she's asking us to really reflect on, she is quoting Professor Ian Robertson, who is a retired linguistics professor, and he has a theory of Creole not simply being language, but being an expression of our post-colonial states. And she's saying, I concur and believe that the refusal of our governments and CARICOM, that's the Caribbean Economic Region, as a body to not validate our Creoles is a perpetuation of colonialism. And I think that's an important thing that came out in our discussion. I am not sure what's going on, but I don't want to waste time. So I'm going to stop going through the chat because clearly there's a conspiracy happening here with my internet. So I want to encourage you to read the chat. I want to open the floor to invite each person to share something that stood out for them based on something somebody else on the panel said, or maybe it's somebody else in the chat who has said something. Like, what is the thing that stood out for you, and what are you carrying with you as you move forward?
Well, maybe I could start. Darren used the word reimagining several times. And that's something that I'm going to take away from this. What is this reimagined decolonial structure? What does decolonized education look like? How do we reimagine a decolonized social work practice and research? And so for me, taking away that reimagining is important, Darren, because it may not be sufficient to only know that something is wrong and something needs to be corrected, but how do we see this in the future? What does it look like, and how is it manifested in the work that we do as educators, researchers, and practitioners?
Thank you, Dr. Boodram.
I would like to, first of all, acknowledge all you, Dr. Rogers, for putting this together, and my esteemed brothers and sisters, colleagues, and for your input. From Sister Zibane, I really appreciate your use of recognizing the need for our understanding of that balance in Ma'at, and it's something that we don't talk about. And it was an ancient way that is still realistic, right? To me, it's a Sankofa thing. How do we pull from the past that which makes sense as we move forward? Sankofa, go and get that which makes sense as we move forward. And Dr. Boodram, I thank you for just helping us to understand, some of the different approaches through these stories that you shared, and how for us that we need to think about as you just shared. And David, definitely I came away with an understanding. Look, at the end of the day, we have to deal and confront the reality of that duality of who we are, that double consciousness that Du Bois talked about, that I have to deal with the fact that while I am an African person, I am also fully bathed in the Eurocentric knowledge. I speak from a Eurocentric perspective sometimes with a Creole background. So I acknowledge, if I tell you today, so you better understand what I'm saying, right? So for me, that is the power that I can bring that duality to the table. But finally, I think some of the things that we want to do as we think about moving forward with our students, and then how do we help our students to understand the notion for critical consciousness as they examine policies, practice, procedures, and beliefs? How do we understand the need, as I think linguistics and the importance that plays in terms of knowing, doing, and being. How do we incorporate more storytelling and proverbial telling and so forth in our assessments? But also, how do we translate that so that the people on the money side can understand where we're coming from, right? But still meeting the needs of our people. And in what ways can knowledge, we can discuss the impacts of racism, colonialism, sexism, colorism, all the isms and the impact that they still continue to have on our communities. And that we have to challenge ourselves in that as well. Frantz Fanon said it best. We have to challenge ourselves. We cannot think that we're exempt from that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Dr. Camacho.
You know, it's so funny. I joke with my friend that, the world kind of, or the universe kind of puts you in, it speaks to you. Just listen to the universe, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that I am joining this group. It came out of the blue to a certain degree, not so much. For the past couple of months, I've been feeling a little drained in terms of doing my work. And as, Dr. Wright brought up, this is not easy work. Necessary reminder. With that said, my research, somebody makes a comment that we're not producing research that influences practice. That is one of my goals. I am developing interventions. I am a social worker, but I do have to infiltrate medical departments, psychiatry, these other more traditional ways of delivering care. Our principles need to infiltrate. We need to collaborate with these different systems. They're far from perfect, that's for sure, but we need to start taking steps in that direction. So this isn't easy work. The universe bringing me together with you all, it's, again, a reminder for me to funnel that rage that I have so that I can continue to do the work that I need to do, to continue to influence practice. I'm probably going to die, and this is not going to be, it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay, but at least we've tried and we're pushing forward. We need to continue to push forward. And that goes also for those who are students. We need to continue to push forward. There is no easy response. This is not easy work. So if anybody is interested, one thing I said about research, we need more social workers in research as well, so that we can do the work, so that we can influence practice. It's not just, in social work, MSWs tends to be a terminal degree. Let's go for that PhD. We need more diversity in the way we see the world. So we need to influence practice. Go out there and get that PhD. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. What an amazing, diverse group of professionals, educators in the room. I looked into the chat, and retired social worker Lionel Remy has evoked Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney, whose work was really happening in the 60s and the 70s. And one of the things he encouraged us to do was to be guerrilla intellectuals. Yeah. I feel like we have a room of guerrilla intellectuals right now in the room on the screen, and also joining us here. And we need to take that charge, to not shy away from confronting systems of oppression, and to acknowledge our complicity in some of those systems. Those systems produced us in very, very real ways. And so we're in the master's house, and we have tools, and yes, we can't dismantle it with his tools, but we can damage it and then draw on our ancestral indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world to mash things up. Yeah. Nicholas Watts said in the chat that that their big takeaway comes from Dr. Boodram, who says that if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's do the work together. And she was citing a very powerful source. I think that's a great way for us to leave today. And of course, this conversation continues. We had a mammoth task to discuss all of these things in maximum an hour and a half. I want to thank you for just being brilliant in pulling things together. I want to recognize the ancestors, however you recognize or you acknowledge the fact that we are a continuation of people who did work before. We are the legacy of people who survived, who chose to survive. I want to encourage us to think about how we can create spaces to continue to support each other in decolonizing our practice around education, around research. And we can only do that in community. You know, our work is about community work, and as educators, we need to know how to operate in community. So we're giving thanks for this powerful work. I want to acknowledge Dr. Joanna Simpson, who was integral in pulling this together, Dr. Mackenzie, who's also in the chat, and they have been continuing this Threads of Change podcast, and it will continue in 2025, and you will have other hosts, and we will be talking about ways towards liberation in different ways. So with that said, I want to thank you for coming and being here, everyone who is with us. You know, we've been up to, I think at one point in time, I saw 80 something people in the room. So we are inspired and nothing is accidental. So we understand that everything here has happened because it should and it was supposed to. So thank you so much. Until we meet again, take care.
Today, when I look around in the world, what do I see? I see footprints that man have left on the sand while walking through times. I see fruits of our ambitions, figments of our imaginations, and I ask myself, when will it end? When will it end? It is plain to see, universally this land is not bountiful as it was, simply because in his quest for success, nothing stands in man's way. All rivers run dry, soon the birds will fly, the mountains will be no longer high. And when I really think of it, I just wonder why, oh why. I see charity deplored, equal rights totally ignored, wisdom and ingenuity working in accord, simply to afford such inventions as thermonuclear warfare and environmental warfare. And I wonder now, where do we go from here? Prophets everywhere gaze upon the horizon and declare that judgment will come as the savage hands of unscrupulous men defile everything passed by. Time is running out as we eat and drink, species at the brink of being extinct. And I think no one can deny that the price of progress is high, real high. I see consciousness as bait, as today we live recklessly. Money make egos inflate and thereby create a turbulent state. I see a struggle between the sexes, new hang-ups and old complexes. Now the question is, right in context, what shall be next? I've already seen this world have come divided between race, color, creed, and class. And some of the things the scripture predict truthfully come to pass. Soil that wouldn't bear Children make him children to be a part of this growing mass. And I ask, if this is progress, how long will it last?